New Jersey is no stranger to industrial accidents. Between 1900 and 1950, as many as 20 major industrial explosions occurred at various factories across the Garden State, along with several dozen smaller ones. Since many of them occurred in the days before OSHA, there was no standardized investigative method for determining the cause of each accident, and so many went officially unsolved. And while we generally had a pretty good idea, in most cases, the disaster was chalked up to a terrible accident. And everyone just kind of picked up their lunch pails and got back to work.
Folks were tougher in those days. I was jitterbugging that very night.
Barring some kind of brazen act of sabotage by a foreign agent or a clear case of malfeasance, no one was usually held accountable. Most of the time. New Jersey was once a booming place for those who make booms. Its strategic location between New York and Philadelphia gave it access to major ports and military installations. Here's a short list. And even during the interwar period, which was nominally peaceful, would continue to perform touch work on long-range landscape adjustment tools. The Nixon Nitration Works, located in what is now Edison, New Jersey, was a massive operation covering some 12 square miles and consisting of hundreds of buildings, founded by naval architect and industrialist Lewis Nixon in 1915. Ever see Band of Brothers? This was the grandfather of Ron Livingston's character. Speaking of World Wars, its original mission was to produce gunpowder for that family dispute between Queen Victoria's grandkids, but soon expanded into general explosives production. Why was it called the Nitration Works? Because nitration is the acid wash process that turns otherwise humble organic material into explodey bits.
Once the tallow hardens, you skim off a layer of glycerin. If you were to add nitric acid, you got nitroglycerin. If you were then to add sodium nitrile, dash of sawdust, you got dynamite. Yeah, with enough soap, one could blow up just about anything.
As a fun aside, once manufacturing of nitrated cotton became commonplace, for at-scale production of gunpowder, it became commercially viable to also produce celluloid camera film, hence the introduction of more cameras in the 1880s. With the end of the war, demand for such things drastically collapsed, but fortunately, founder Lewis Nixon was able to retool his company to keep up with the times. See, if there's one thing for which the government can be relied upon, it's military spending. As the kids say, we're about to find out why Americans don't have public health care. Thus, at World's End, there was a surplus of unused merch, which, for reasons later made painfully apparent by Picatinny Arsenal circa 1926, we didn't want to just keep lying around indefinitely. And so, rather than end a good working relationship for all involved parties, the government didn't cancel outstanding contracts, but rather reoriented them. So what's inside a bomb? At the time, an explosive mixture called amytal was popular, which was a combination of ammonium nitrate and TNT. Then, as now, there was a shortage of TNT, and this cocktail allowed manufacturers to stretch their supply quite a bit. It's not quite as sketchy as a bar watering down the Patron and Grey Goose while charging full price. Don't ask me how I know, since ammonium nitrate is still technically an explosive in its own right. The key takeaway here for our discussion is that ammonium nitrate is also used as a fertilizer, and it's possible to separate it from the TNT. At some point, someone did the math and realized that demilitarizing bombs and selling the plant food was good business, and as someone who eats, I appreciate that. But what about all the TNT? Shh, don't worry about that. So by the 1920s, the 10,000-foot view of the Nixon operation was something like this. Artillery shells were stored at Raritan Arsenal. The Columbia Salvage Company, owned by Charles Levine, performed the meltout to extract the explosive fill, and then transferred it to the Ammonite Company, run by Norris Shreve, which leased a building within the larger Nixon Industrial Park, which also produced various other types of energetic material, like gunpowder and nitrocellulose. It was in the Ammonite building where they separated one flavor of boom goo from the other, and from there, further processing could occur. It was a lucrative government contract, energy-intensive, and, shocker, highly dangerous. It was March 1st, 1924. about 11:30 in the morning. The building leased by the Ammonite Company, where the ammonium nitrate was separated from ammitol, and which contained approximately 90,000 gallons of crystallized ammonium nitrate. For comparison, that's about 10 of these above-ground swimming pools. The whole thing exploded. We don't know the exact reason why, because, let's be frank, there wasn't anyone left to ask. The initial explosion was massive, destroying the building and killing the workers inside. Nearby, roofers working on another building were killed or injured by the blast. Even those indoors weren't spared as windows shattered and doors blew off their hinges. Local structures within a few hundred yards of ground zero were blown over or otherwise damaged. And if that wasn't bad enough, flaming debris rained down on the rest of the sprawling complex. Other buildings were still producing goodies like gunpowder nitrocellulose, the latter of which was stacked in sheets in the building just next door. One of many that just caught fire following the initial explosion. Due to the flammable contents of many of the buildings, the fire spread more quickly than usual, eventually consuming 40 structures at the Nixon Works. An entire square mile was soon up in flames, fed by building material and other combustibles. First responders soon arrived. Firefighters attempted to douse the flames. Ambulances carried some of the 100 wounded off-site, but the Army Hospital at Raritan Arsenal was the primary triage center and was located just next door, well within the area of danger. Make no mistake, this was a disaster and only narrowly avoided becoming a catastrophe. You'll recall the nearby Raritan Arsenal? They stored some 500,000 explosive shells on site in a number of magazines, and their neighbor was currently on fire. 4 of those magazines had been crushed by the pressure wave caused by the blast, and 2 others had their roofs blown off. Keep in mind that at the time it would have been a flimsy corrugated steel roof and not good for much more than a light rain, but still they were damaged and offered even less protection than normal. As evening descended, shifting winds threatened to drive the fire directly into those storage magazines at the arsenal. Had that happened, the shells stored on site would have eventually cooked off, as happened multiple times previously. Thankfully, quick action by the local arsenal personnel prevented the fire from ever reaching that far. Many of them were probably around for the Morgan explosion, or at least had heard about it, since it was like right down the road and only like 8 years before. And that surely motivated them in their efforts here. The crisis was soon over. As it was, 18 people had been killed. Some sources say 20. This included not only the explosives handlers and roofers, but also office workers and a family who lived too close to the plant. An estimated 100 people were injured in the blast and ensuing fires. An entire community was affected. Windows were shattered for up to a mile away. Doors were torn off their hinges. The tremors were felt as far away as New York City. Even after the crisis was brought under control, people were understandably shaken. And not least of all because this seemed to happen with some frequency. So naturally, the authorities wanted answers. Not 2 days later, the Middlesex County prosecutor initiated an inquiry, and I have to say, pretty efficient for government work. Key figures were the president of the Ammonite Company, Norris Shreve, and the man with his name on the sign, Lewis Nixon. The Secretary of War also conducted a separate investigation just to rule out any possible wrongdoings on the part of the Army, which ultimately came up negative. But the main finger-pointing occurred between Nixon and Shreve, as there were no witnesses to precisely what happened, and written procedures were just kind of a thing for those nerds in the white lab coats. It wasn't clear that this was anything other than a terrible accident. Eventually, they settled on the explanation that residual TNT washed into a small stream on the site, day after day, slowly accumulating until a probable mass of 120 pounds had formed. And then something,
Phase 3, profit.
kaboom. Okay, that's possible, kinda. So not to geek out here too much, but just for context, ammonium nitrate is water soluble and TNT is not. That's the basis for the separation process. However, a tiny amount of TNT can plausibly, potentially, kinda sorta also get carried away with the rinse. But we're talking like 0.2%. It's not a lot, but the argument here is that over time and given enough total volume, this could accumulate. That keyword there, could. Keep in mind that still leaves us without an ignition source, or an explanation for how this residual TNT was configured. Meaning, a teaspoon, a block, a puddle? Configuration matters for energetic material. Personally, I think this was a high-profile event that demanded action, since residents were starting to think maybe they didn't want high explosives production in their literal backyards. And so the DA had to be seen doing something. And that something was to land a conviction for manslaughter against the Ammonite Company for the wrongful death of its 15 employees. What about the other 3? Meh. And they were obliged to pay the punitive damages of a $9,000 fine and $12,000 in widow's compensation, so like the princely sum of $1,400 per victim, or like 25,000 in current bucks. How much of that actually made it to the victims' families versus just paid to the government? Following that, it gets kind of messy. The Ammonite Company attempted to sue the Nixon Nitration Works for leaving so much flammable material around. Like, that's an interesting take. Like, yeah, we had an explosion, but your stuff caught fire. It's kind of like when the kids pole vault onto the couch and smash the TV, then blame it on the fact that the TV was there.
I never asked you. Yeah. You like guacamole? Ah! The bunk beds were a terrible idea. Why did you let us do that?
Ultimately, a judge was like, shut up, you're being ridiculous, and dismissed the case, leaving the Columbia Salvage Company the sole defendant. Huh? What did I do? I'll admit they were only mentioned like once or twice, so I'm not solid on the connection here, but it appears that Columbia was technically the primary contractor, so it was ultimately their responsibility to oversee safety. That's the legal rationale, but do they actually do anything in a real sense? Don't know. So that's the surface level take in the official legal case, but is it possible to determine what actually happened? Well, here are the facts. As previously mentioned, there were no direct witnesses to the final events leading up to the disaster, but going off past experience, we can make some educated guesses. Full disclosure, what follows is speculation on my part. Recall that the explosion occurred around 11:30 in the morning. I find that time noteworthy because in those days, it was typical to run an operation like this in multiple shifts of 8 hours, with a change in shift occurring around midday. So as the guys are about to get off shift, they start thinking about getting home or making their way to the nearest diner for some steak and eggs. Attention begins to wander, mistakes get made. Compound this with generally lax standards for safety and waste disposal, and you get a recipe for disaster. In the plus column, this was one of many similar incidents that would contribute to the drive for standardization and improvements to workplace safety in decades to come. 2 years after the accident, legal troubles dogged the Ammonite Company and it was dissolved. Following that, the owner, Mr. Shreve, went on to teach at Purdue University, which must have been an interesting experience. Class starts cutting up and he's like, my last job blew up and I was never convicted. Founder and owner Lewis Nixon sadly passed away in 1940, leaving his son Stanhope to oversee operations through World War II. Rumors at the time claimed it was due to chemical poisoning from his time at the Nitro Works, but this appears to be just that. Rumor. As an interesting aside, his grandson Lewis Nixon III served in the Airborne. That's Ron Livingston's character from Band of Brothers. Charles Levine, the owner of the Columbia Salvage Company, also got out of that business following the disaster and tried to claim the Orteig Prize for flying solo across the Atlantic Ocean. Bummer for him, though, the other Charles, Lindbergh, beat him to it by 2 weeks. Actually a genuine bummer, because he wasn't halted due to mechanical failure or ill preparation, but his navigator filed a restraining order after he was fired. An interesting story for sure, but not a New Jersey one, so we're walking. In time, the nitration works were sold off and repurposed. Today, the site is occupied by the Middlesex Community College campus and the Raritan Industrial Park. Because when I think industrial accident, my next thoughts are school. Why? Just ask the Sayreville Bombers. That'll about do it for me. If you've stuck with me this far, thank you so much for watching. Sources in the description as usual. This has been Words and Coffee. Until next time.